how many times have you heard over the past 2 months that Zionism is European colonialism? That Zionism is fascism? That Zionism is racism? I'm here to share with you today a long overdue explanation of what actually is Zionism. Most people, when they try to explain Zionism, they begin with a man named Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl is known as the father of modern day Zionism, or the political movement of Zionism, but he didn't invent Zionism. In fact, Zionism goes back about 2,000 years. Okay, so probably you know this, but just in case you don't, for over 1,000 years, Jewish communities, kingdoms thrived in the land of Israel. And this goes all the way back from biblical times until the year 70 CE. And that's when the Romans conquered Israel, exiled the Jews, and even though we might debate about the accuracy about certain stories in the Bible, there is no debate about the fact that Israelites settled in the land of Israel, that King David made Jerusalem the capital of the Jewish people, that the temple stood there, and that Jesus, who was Jewish, walked on those very streets. So essentially the concept of Zionism was established then, in the year 70 CE. And basically all that Zionism means is the return to Zion. Zion being another name for the city of Jerusalem. But here's something that even most Jews don't know. The first time Zionism was actually physically implemented was even 400 years before that. The Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, which led to the Babylonian exile to the area of what is modern day Iran. King Cyrus, known as Cyrus the Great, managed to defeat the Babylonians and establish the Persian Empire. And this empire that stretched across the globe included Jerusalem as well. And one of the things that King Cyrus did, he issued a warrant for them to return, for the Jews to return from exile to Jerusalem. And this was facilitated by two characters in Jewish history known as Ezra and Nehemiah. And that return to Zion, or in Hebrew known as Shivat Zion, which is literally translated to return to Zion, was the first physical act of pure Zionism. But sadly, not all Jews decided to immediately return to Zion, resulting in the story of Purim, when a very wicked man wanted to commit genocide on the Jews. Yes, that's what happens when the Jews are in diaspora and don't have a state of Israel to defend them. So the Jews came back, Zionism, everything's great, 400 years, and then the Romans come and kick them all out again. And this time, the exile lasted 2,000 years. And in those 2,000 years of diaspora, where Jews were scattered all across the world, that's when Jewish prayers were written, Jewish literature, Jewish history. And that's how Jews managed to maintain themselves as an ethno-religious group without physically being the owners of the land of Israel for 2,000 years. During this time, as you probably know, the Romans changed the name of Israel to Syria Palestina in order to humiliate the Jews and try to disconnect them from the land. But it didn't work, because it was there in the diaspora that the return to our ancestral homeland of Zion would essentially be integrated into every part of religious, ethnic, national, and cultural aspect, every aspect of Jewish life. For example, Jews pray facing Jerusalem, no matter where they are in the world. 3 times a day, a prayer is said calling for the return to Zion and for the reestablishment of self-autonomy for the Jewish people in their indigenous homeland. At wedding ceremonies, grooms for over 2,000 years have been saying that if they forget Zion, they'll forget their right hand. And then they smash a glass to remember the destruction of the temple. For 2,000 years, at every Passover table, in every Jewish household around the world, it has always been said, next year in Jerusalem. And again, while Theodor Herzl may be considered the father of political modern Zionism, there's many different types of Zionism, such as religious Zionism, social Zionism, but what is shared among all the different types of Zionism is the fact that Zionism is deeply rooted in Judaism. And it's because the land of Israel is a central and integral part of Judaism, and it has been that way for over 3,000 years. So when people say that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, you cannot actually make that claim, because Zionism is an integral part of Judaism, from the religious aspect, from the cultural aspect, from the historical aspect, and from all aspects of what it means to be Jewish. Since being conquered by the Romans, however, there was always returns to the land of Israel by Jews around the world. And so the land of Israel has always been inhabited consecutively for 3,000 years by Jews. At times there were more, and at times there were less. Initially, the Jews believed that a return to Zion would only happen through prayer and when the Messiah comes. But for 2,000 years, everything in the Jewish religion was preparing the Jewish people for the return to Israel. For example, the Jewish calendar revolves around the annual cycles and seasons of the land of Israel. The rabbis who taught and developed the foundation of Jewish practice lived in the land of Israel, writing the Jewish literature known as the Mishnah, and the basis for all Jewish law was written in Israel as well. Many Jews from around the world over many years tried to come back to Israel, but it was dangerous to do so, and many died along the way. One famous rabbi who did so successfully in the 13th century was a rabbi named Moses ben Nachman, and he led a whole wave of immigration coming in from North Africa. And they found the city of Jerusalem basically deserted and destroyed, left by the Crusaders. This successful wave of immigration created a time in which Judaism flourished in the Holy Land. And many of the synagogues that they built in the 13th century still exist today. The Spanish Inquisition of 1492 brought yet another wave of Jewish migration back to its ancestral homeland. A famous descendant of that wave of immigration is a famous rabbi called Yosef Karo. That's the spiritual side of Judaism, the modern Kabbalah that many people study today, like Madonna, and it's based in a city called Tzfat. During the 15th and 16th century, Tzfat was a global center for Jewish studies. But something pivotal happened around the 18th century. Rabbis started talking about not waiting for the Messiah, that prayer wouldn't bring redemption, and that true redemption would only happen when Jews started to take practical action to return, rebuild, and resettle the land of Israel. So you know those ultra-Orthodox rabbis you see on the streets of London and New York protesting against Zionism? That's exactly why. It's not that they're protesting with the Free Palestine movement. It's that they believe that Jews shouldn't settle the land until the Messiah comes. They're a very small fringe of Judaism today, but you shouldn't be fooled. They're not out there on the streets protesting against Israel because they're advocating for a Palestinian state. So now we get to Europe, because up until then, basically all Zionism was Zionism that came from Jews of the Middle East, North Africa, Spain, certainly not European white colonialism. For years, they were suffering extreme oppression, segregation, persecution. And that's where we get Herzl, who comes and basically says, listen guys, enough is enough. We've been slowly coming back to Israel for over 2,000 years, but we need to start making this political. We need the world to understand that the time for the Jews to resettle and rebuild their ancestral homeland is now. We're not going to make it anymore in Europe. And he was right, because this was way before the Holocaust, and he basically knew a Holocaust is coming. So that's when political action began to be taken in order to establish an actual Jewish state. Mind you, up until about a few hundred years ago, there were no really nation states in the world. So this was also a time in which nation state kind of became a thing and people started talking about it. And yes, while we recognize that there were other people over 2,000 years who inhabited the land of Israel, there was never a nation state called Palestine. And that's why in 1947, when the UN voted in favor of a partition plan, one state for the Arabs and one state for the Jews not only accepted, but they also said and put into their Declaration of Independence, any non-Jews who will be living in Israel will be granted full equal rights. And that's evident till today with the 2 million Israeli Arabs who are completely equal under the law in Israel. So as you can see, Zionism is certainly not a European concept. It's definitely not a racist ideology. And it's certainly not about white supremacy, as Israel is a diverse and multifaceted country comprising of people of all faiths and all colors. Contrary to what you might have been told, Zionism is not colonialism. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Zionism is the decolonization of the Jewish people's ancestral homeland, finally taking it away from Roman conquerors, Byzantine conquerors, Persian conquerors, Muslim conquerors, the Ottomans, the British. And that's why in order to be a Zionist, you don't need to be a Jew. You just need to agree that the Jews have a right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland.